Welcome everyone. This is the second one of these that I've done, and kind of looking forward to them. Also still trying to test the kit out, so I'm not quite sure I've quite got it quite right. Trying lots of different kinds of camera things. Today I have I'm using Camo Studio on my iPhone to be the cam here, because I don't want the cam to come off of the computer that has Ableton on it, and of course that's then streaming out over HDMI to another computer that's then broadcasting this out to to YouTube and wherever else. Now, I mean, what you're just hearing there is a piece that I euphemistically term 174 hertz, because I've been listening to or looking at that kind of New Age meditation sort of area of things, and this kind of solfeggi scale. Whilst I'm not going to challenge their theories, I will also say that the solfeggi scale has been around for a very long time, and is and essentially gets their name essentially from the Latin that's at the beginning of the various liturgical sort of texts that that these pieces are about. I mean, if you want to read a little bit about them, you can see them being referred to in a variety of quite old books, though. From the 14th, 15th, 16th century. You can look at the stuff from the 9th century. You can find all of these sorts of ideas there. And really, it's not necessarily a new discovery. Maybe we might call it a rediscovery. I don't know. But the idea of linking these different kinds of frequencies to aspects of health and well-being, whether that's meditation or that's to do with pain relief and so on and so forth. So basically they have a variety of kind of pieces that are supposed to be reflective of a particular kind of, I suppose, a frequency that would correspond with a kind of a scale position. So this one, 174 hertz, turns out to be F. And so everything in this sort of piece that I've just opened up with is in F, right? Everything's in F. And then you get this movement down to the like the C and so on. So you just kind of get this pedaling sort of idea, this kind of wash. I just put that together. I did actually try and do another one, which was 396, because that's the next note up, and that'll be G. Not successful, so I think I might need to go back to the drawing board. But really, the thing is that what this illustrates is really how, I suppose, and this is the thing that annoys most people, I suppose, in terms of internet forums, is this idea of when people go, use your ears, and you just want to say, I'm trying, just give me some like practical things that I can deal with. In many ways, like understanding what's in the world of F, let's say, right? What's in the world of F allows you to appreciate the places that you can go to sort of express an idea around F, right? Because F doesn't necessarily need to be referred to purely as just, say, the root or the tonic. F could be referred to as a part of something else. F is also found in say the harmonic center of B flat something, whether that's B flat major or B flat minor, or any kind of mode thereof, or most of them anyway. We will find F, which then of course leads to the next question that we also find F not necessarily in places of harmonic stability like fifths and so on. We'll also find F in places or in positions that will be a little bit more kind of tense, like major sevenths. F is in the key of G flat. It's scale degree 7, and it gives you, as a cumulative sound or as a part of an overall sound of G flat, it will give you the impression of the major seventh. So you can in terms of like understanding theory and all those, or musicianship and all of these kinds of applications, it really, the idea is kind of going to a place where you can control things, where you can control how you want something to be represented. Do you want to hear it in a relatively pleasant sort of nice kind of undulating sort of not disturbing kind of sound? Is that what you hear? Or do you want to hear something that's a good deal more, tense? fruity, as my old tutor at Goldsmiths would say. You know, so this is kind of what we're sort of investigating within these ideas of Ableton by numbers, is not to really, in many ways, I'm trying to approach music theory or musicianship from inside the DAW. And if we use the things that we see on a kind of a daily basis, assuming you're using similar tools to me when you're using Ableton, and that means things like utility or devices like operator or analog, or you use the resonators, or you use anything, you use the pitch plugins, you use any of that sort of stuff, then you will be able to sort of take this information, put it into there, and then use it to kind of modify or adapt what it is that you're kind of working with. Because within a computer domain, we sort of make an assumption that somehow you're going to be playing, like keyboards, let's say. As a guitarist, most of the time guitar synths were never quite up to snuff to be able to be used as controllers. So the main controlling mechanism in most music ends up becoming this metaphor of the keyboard, which is a real problem, because it then sort of says to you, if you feel that you don't necessarily have the skill to be a competent keyboard player, you sort of feel a bit more sort of kind of absented, and therefore you will sort of maybe not participate as wholly or avoid certain sorts of things because you feel, maybe it's not for you, I don't know. And that's really the tyranny of keyboard players. Any angry keyboard players, please don't do this. Don Buchler felt the same things when Robert Moog attached a traditional keyboard paradigm to the Moog synthesizer, thereby commissioning or allowing a whole host of classically trained kind of piano players to essentially dominate synthesis from the perspective of kind of classical technique. That in itself is also really a problem when you consider what synthesizers were actually supposed to do. They weren't supposed to replicate the past, and they weren't necessarily meant to replicate horns or anything else like that. It's a byproduct that they do, because theoretically, all sounds can be modeled. But the tyranny of the keyboards, 10 fingers, all of that sort of stuff, And and that also kind of causes problems when you're in the DAW, because really, in many ways, when we use a synthesizer, it doesn't matter whether it's analog operator or serum or Sylenth or anything else, oscillators can be really rich, right? And then you add all of these kind of detuning sort of partials and various other things, and so what you end up with is actually a very thick or quite rich sound. And one of the things that we will gravitate towards as this whole kind of series unfolds is really the idea of how you might stack notes together, so that in many ways stacking notes together is kind of your first intervention in terms of using EQ. This is how arrangers work. So arrangement essentially means that you're balancing things out across whatever the voices are, whether they're orchestral, whether it's a jazz group, whether it's a set of synthesizers, right? And you're balancing them out across the spectrum. And by sort of you being judicious in terms of the voicings that you do, whilst you will probably still need to use some EQ, you won't need to be quite as aggressive in the application of EQ unless that's the sound you're actually looking for. And so voicing becomes this really important aspect to the work that we do. And by, I mean, I'm not a great fan of these kinds of plugins, but I can see there's quite a big difference between, say, the approach of, say, Captain Chord and like the Unison pack or any of those sorts of other sorts of things. When I look at them and I look at the various videos and promotional stuff around them, I can see that there's quite a big difference between the two, in that, say, Unison has a better understanding of chord voicing, whereas Captain Chords tends to give you the chords in as close voiced a position as possible. And by being close voiced, what that also then does is it creates mud. So it's almost like the Unison pack has at least preempted this by and it's a very simple solution. I'm going to show you how to do it in a second. Have preempted this by revoicing the chords so that you avoid some of the muddiness that will come about. Whereas Captain Chords in many ways kind of leaves you to kind of solve this problem for yourself. And that may or may not be a good thing depending on your kind of grasp of things. Therefore, it makes you more reliant on tools like EQ. So you could, you know, defensively kind of do something. Right, I'm going to stop this track now. I'm not sure whether you feel relaxed or not. You can tell me in the comments. I don't know. So here we go. So I'm basically going to take an operator. So I'm going to play a... just going to turn that up now. So that's a major triad. And if we change the octave down, you can hear it gets muddier and muddier. If we go up, it kind of gets, you know, it gets brighter as it goes up, and we lose some of those lower harmonics and we get sort of the more upper ones coming in. So let's say, you know, you have that. So for us to be able to model that, if we're not playing it on the keyboard, and by the way, I'm only using my QWERTY keyboard. I actually don't use a keyboard in the sense of a piano keyboard or controller. I really just use the QWERTY keyboard. I find it quite enjoyable, but also it creates challenges because you are essentially presented with an octave and a second, which is basically the distance of a ninth. And therefore it requires you to kind of revoice and reposition notes so that you can continue to play some things in real time. You know, so worth kind of thinking about. Okay, so if we take a chord plugin, so the thing about the chord plugin is that it gives you, it's a pass-through device in that if we play one note, that one note will be assumed to be the root. That's the bass note. And therefore that note will pass through. So we don't have to do anything for that note. But what we will do is put in the third and the fifth, which are the elements of the triad. So for the major triad, we use the notes 4, which is the third. So you can hear that second note if I take it off. That's just the root note, C, on its own. So 4 is a major third. This is one of those things where you have to kind of get used to the two types of language that are in operation. Referring to the interval as a major third, but then referring to the number of semitones as 4. And there will be moments. I mean, I'm sure that sometimes, even on my videos, sometimes I have to correct myself because I make the, you know, I get them kind of mixed in, and I find myself sort of over kind of compensating, you know, by going, so like we're going up to chord 4 and that's 5 and that's really 5 semitones, and then we follow that by the fifth, which is 7, you know, and it's like, yeah, you know, this is you can see why sometimes people would just go, ooh, it's messing with my head, but really just kind of stick in there because the if there is any pain, it will last for a relatively short period of time, trust me. So 4 is a major third, and 7 gives us the fifth. La da da. If I turn that off, that's a major third without the chord plugin. And now just playing the root note of C, we get the same sound. But what we can hear is that it is quite muddy in that register. I mean, if we transpose it up an octave, it becomes less muddy. But the thing about a third is that it has a lot of overtones and resonances. So therefore it is particularly prone to making your chords kind of muddy, right? So the simple solution to this problem is essentially to transpose whatever the lowest note is that you have. If you're playing some chords and you're thinking, it's not sounding right, it's sounding muddy, what sorts of solutions could I try? One of the best pieces of advice that you can do is to take the lowest note. So the lowest note in this sequence here is 4, right? That's the lowest note. That's the note closest to 0, 4. Transpose it up an octave. So you add 12 to 4, right? This is where we find ourselves in that kind of number zone again. So 12 plus 4 is 16. So if we transpose it up an octave, so it's up an octave plus a major third, we get a brighter chord sound, right? I mean, you can listen to, I mean, there are quite a lot of EDM tunes. I mean, Avicii was not, you know, you use this sort of stuff quite often. You get sort of stuff like Alessio and so on, where you have, I remember listening to some Laid Back Luke. He also did it as well. You find it a lot in country as well. I mean, if I turn off the fifth, I have to put the scale plugin in, but you get the idea. Quite a rich sound. That's just 2 notes. That's the roots, the 16 semitones. The 16 semitones, which is basically a major third up an octave, is referred to as a major tenth. So this sound of tenths is a very bright sort of sound. So once we add the fifth back in, which is 7, we have a much sort of a cleaner chordal landscape, right? Let's go back to 4, right? Muddy. And then you might go, my production sucks, or the sound of stuff is not what I want it to do, or it doesn't sound like the records or the recordings that I'm listening to. And you sort of wonder what you should be doing. And of course, what then happens is you post on a forum and you go, and some smart Alex says, use your ears. And you're like, I would love to, just tell me how. This is how, right? And it will work whether it's you know, here's the minor. So the minor third is 3. Now that's really like a bit dirty, right? So if we add 12 to 3, we have 15. It's brighter, right? We will still need to use EQ because that root note is actually sticking out. So some of the things that we can try are like things like transposition. Now, if, you know, transposing something up or down means changing octaves. Now on Ableton, you can use the Command X and Command Z sort of take you up and down various octaves if you're using the QWERTY keyboard. But if you had, let's say you have already a MIDI clip that's already playing and you just want to save yourself the editing time of just trying out lots of different transpositions and you just want to do it in the rough before you commit, then use the pitch plugin, right? So here it is as minor, C minor. If we were to transpose it up a fourth, so that means we go to chord 4, which is 5 semitones. Here we are again, right? It's now up a fourth. And we can hear that's a much brighter sound. If I turn it off and go back to 0, you know. So a combination of voicing and transposition, whilst it is not 100% the total solution, it is a solution that gets you, 80 to 90% clean in terms of your productions. And it's really worth spending your time kind of investigating these parts. The problem is, you might not necessarily know which bits do I need to change. In terms of block chords, the third is always the main culprit. I mean, most guitar bands, like rock bands, they develop power chords. They develop power chords that are basically root fifth octave. And they develop those chords without any thirds. By not having any thirds, when you have lots of overdrive, you don't create lots of kind of overtones and harmonics that kind of make the sound become unstable, right? Because when you use distortion, you're essentially amplifying various harmonic sort of characteristics. And if you took something like a major third and then you put that through distortion, it creates quite an unstable sound, especially if you're on the guitar, and I am. So this is one of those kinds of things that you learn as you go along, because you if you hang out with bands and you sort of play enough times and you and you sort of, you know, you read magazines and so on, and you read stuff where different players will say, this is, you know, this is how I do it. But of course, we're not in that time anymore, and we're using DAW. So we still, but those sorts of ideas still ring true. They are still a part of our tool set. There are still parts of things that we should still kind of incorporate into our playing, and we should be able to use them to help us to improve our work. So this is really what's kind of at the core of this sort of idea. So clearly, transposing something away from the root note brightens it up. The further away from the root note you go, the brighter something will become. What also happens is we also kind of create holes, gaps between notes. So the difference between this, which is the root and the fifth, and this, which is the root and the fifth and octave higher, which is 19, there's quite a big gap in between those two, right? So we need to manage that gap, and that's why, you know, you can use things like octaves to kind of fill it out. But this is why something like a third, and I'm going to do the third, the octave like in the same register as the root, so you get that muddiness, right? That is so muddy. That sounds like a really confused chord, but actually it's a major triad. But when we put it up an octave, brightness, right? So for you, the basic rule, you know, if someone counters you and says use your ears, this is how we use our ears, right? But you also need the rules of thumb that help you to understand that you're proceeding in the right direction. And those rules of thumb are basically about, you know, the closer a note is to the root note. So let's say 4 to 0 is the lowest note, right? So the major third, which is 4. So from the distance from 0 to 4 is a much smaller distance than the distance from 0 to 7, right? We can agree on that. So the note that's closest to the root will probably be one of the sources of this kind of harmonic kind of disturbance, this lack of clarity. So that's usually the note that you should transpose first. So if we take 4, transpose it up an octave, add 12, you come up with 16. We have a clearer sound. If we add the fifth into there, it's a stable sound. It will work. If we have it as 3, or 4, sorry, it's quite muddy, right? You can hear it beating. One of the things we can also do is also remove the root, right? But obviously with the Chord plugin, we can't do that. What we would have to do is do it inside the clip. So that's not an option that's available to us right now. So we have that. So we can have 16 as a major third, and 15 is the minor third, okay? But up an octave. So any of these sorts of intervals, when we transpose them up by an octave, they are known as compound intervals. So anything that's within an octave is known as a simple interval. And it's a compound when you add 12. Okay, so you're compounding the interval. And you can compound them up to, you know, 3 octaves and so on. But at some point it becomes, they become things that you don't really sort of sing. Most people don't have the range to kind of cover those kinds of note distances. But in this way, we don't have to rely on EQ quite so much, and we can sort of make changes at an early enough stage, you know, an early enough stage of intervention to be able to kind of take a defensive kind of view about our chord voicings. So essentially, in many ways, this is one of those key differences, say, that I observe when I see the different videos for Captain Chords and Unison Pack or any of the other ones, that some prepare in advance this idea of chord voicing. So, and it might just be particular to their videos that I've watched. I mean, I don't spend my time watching their videos that much. But the odd ones that I've seen, there are some that I just sort of go, surely if you've built a computer program, you could actually just build this into it. Whereas something like the Unison Pack seems to practice a more sort of a better understanding of voicing. So this is something that you should kind of think about if you are using these sorts of tools in your kind of daily work. That where something that they're not perfect solutions. What you will still need to do is to basically go back and just kind of rectify stuff. But you see, this is where we come back to that whole thing where people say, use your ears, and you go, yeah, tell me how do I use my ears? Well, here we go. You know, you go back into something like Captain Chords or whatever, and you look for the note that's nearest the root note, right? And then you put it up an octave. And then once you've done that, that might well actually solve most of your problems. The thing to understand and appreciate here is that these are really simple solutions to problems. If we have to solve them much further down the road with big old EQs or dynamic EQs or sidechaining and whatever else, and none of these are being used because they're creative solutions that we're creating a sound, they are defensive solutions because we're correcting things, right? So the earliest point of intervention is really to be able to do it, you know, as early as possible. And voicing is one of those places. It's exactly the same or similar sorts of principles can be applied to oscillators in terms of like oscillator groupings, how to make it clearer, right? So that's one of those ideas that you should really kind of consider. Now, in the videos that I did that was released yesterday, and the last few videos that I've done using kind of play-along kind of tracks. So I released the first of those on Monday, and that one was a dub reggae piece. I use the term lightly. It's not really an authentic dub reggae piece, but it's enough to kind of practice the idea. And there are two key patterns that I would encourage you to use. The first pattern is the idea of using the 1-4-5 chord progression. So the 1-4-5, whether we're doing them as major chords or minor chords, the 1-4-5 is kind of a fundamental for most kind of popular music. So we will find it in almost, you know, it's very ubiquitous. We will find it in everything. So it's a good place to kind of start when you're trying to navigate this area of kind of musicianship and music theory, because we're dealing with the more kind of common, frequently encountered information. So 1-4-5, so the numbers, if we look at the pitch window, and I'll have to look down, so forgive me for a sec. The numbers are 0, 5, which gives us chord 4, and 7, which gives us chord 5. So in names of notes, if we were in the key of C, 0 would be C, 5 would be F, and 7 would be G. Now, whether we do this as C minor, that's the 4 chord, gone up 5 semitones, gone up to the 5 chord, which is 7 semitones, or we do it as major, we will hear that. So the track, I mean, I encourage you to download it, but the track is basically just gives you a context to practice this sort of idea. Now, the other pattern, which is a much more kind of interesting pattern to kind of deploy within this kind of 1-4-5 type of idea, is the one that uses 0, 1, which is what we will term the flat 2, the flattened second, and then -2, which we will refer to as the flattened 7th. So this gives us a very different sound. I'll just program a chord up really quickly. I'll make it minor and extend it. And keep it low. So this is 0. So this is the root note. Okay, we go up to 1. Okay, and then we go to -2. And then we go back to 0. Okay, so in the context of something like a bass line, which is what this track was all about, let me get the right notes. So what you have there is basically a bass line. Let me fold that so you can see it. It's basically just bouncing between the root and the fifth, C to G. So in the key of C, C is the root and G is the fifth. Because this is a very sort of stable bass line. What I mean stable is that it doesn't matter where we transpose it, its shape will always remain the same, so that it will pretty much work for any chord position. So if we go +1, and then we go back to 0, this is -2, up to 1, and then back to 0. Right? So the idea is being able to modify the underlying information. We can choose to play it safe and use a 1-4-5. So that would be 0, 5, and then 7, and then back to 0. Right? And then the next one is the more adventurous one, up 1, and then down 2, and then back to 0. Now the thing is that my whole goal here is to not necessarily for us just to compartmentalize this information and to go, here we should only use 1-4-5, and here we should only use 1, flat 2, flat 7. Interesting things can come about because we create a crossover in terms of the information, our understanding of things, right? So if we went -2 and then up to the 5, which is the 4 chord, you can see why this causes a problem in real time, and then back to 0. So we can use elements of the 1-4-5 and elements of this kind of figure. We can use 7, 1, which is an interesting sound, and then back to 0. Right? Now this is in many ways kind of facilitated because of what I will refer to as the stability of the bass line. The bass line is essentially just the root and the fifth. Almost every chord, whether it's major or minor, has a root and a fifth. Therefore, it leads to this kind of stability that I refer to. So we could transpose it up to and have similar kind of effect. We can go to up to 5. We can go to 8, and then back to 0. But the problem that presents to us is that from my perspective, and if we combine it with this idea of use your ears, in many ways we need to learn these sorts of patterns. We need to learn patterns that work to then be able to subvert those patterns, right? To be able to hybridize them by chopping a bit off from here and a bit from here and then smashing them together, or choosing to ignore them entirely, or choosing to play them backwards, or to start in the middle and work out. You can once you've kind of got those kinds of patterns together, you can move them around in lots of different sorts of ways. After all, we do similar things with drum patterns, and we should be able to do similar things with bass lines like this. We should also be able to do similar things with chords, harmonies, but obviously that's a little bit more, that might take a little bit more effort. We might need a little bit more time, but we can certainly do it in terms of the bass lines that we use. Now, in the few remaining minutes that there are, and I'm going to look at my iPad again because obviously what happens is I very rarely ever look at my iPad, so I'm really sorry. I spend my time sort of thinking about this stuff. And hey Ashok, how you doing? I haven't been looking at the chat, so I'm really sorry. In the last few remaining minutes that we have, one of the things that is in the video that was released yesterday, the idea was about taking these ideas here that we have in terms of these patterns and then applying them in the automation or clip automation envelope window, right? So if we were to do a transposing sequence of 4 bars, okay, so we're going to do 4 bars, we duplicate the loop so that we end up with a 4-bar pattern. So we can see that we've got exactly the same notes. Nothing is really changing here, right? So the way that change is going to be achieved is that every bar we will move to something else. So for here we're going to go for 5, which is the 4 chord. And here, oh, didn't pick that bit up, we're going to go for 7. So you can see it goes back down to the C, up to the 7, which is the 5, which is G, and then back down to the C. So, and then it kicks off again, right? And that's our 4-bar loop. But when we look at the MIDI information, nothing's changing, right? So change, I mean, you know, one of my kind of points here is to get you into the idea that change can be made in any number of areas, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be in the domain purely of keyboard playing. It doesn't have to be that at all. I mean, you don't have to be the world's greatest keyboard player to be able to come up with really interesting kind of MIDI parts, right? Right? I mean, otherwise, only keyboard players would be doing everything, and most of us would be out of our jobs and doing this sort of stuff. So it's not necessarily something that requires you to have an absolutely solid technique. It's nice to have, but really, it doesn't necessarily mean or follow on that the things that you will do will necessarily be any better. So we can make change in a number of areas. We can play them in. We can use, we can draw them in using the pencil tool, and of course we can also use automation like this, right? So if I wanted to say do the change of the +1, oh, it won't let me pick it up. There we go. -2, and then back to 0. There we go. So this is 0, 1. -2. Now, automation also gives us some really sort of interesting potential applications in that we could, oops, jump the octave, sorry. We can also, say, do smaller transpositions. So rather than transposing the whole pattern, we might just transpose sections. And that's a bit an odd one, that one. Let's try it in 5. So we have 0, 1, and we might choose to repeat the same pattern here. Maybe we go to 7 there. Now this may or may not be things that we would come up with in terms of playing on the piano, and they are definitely slightly more experimental applications in terms of the clip window. And I'm not saying that this by any stroke of the imagination is the most definitive version that we could actually do. I'm sure with a little bit more work and refinement we'll come up with something really killer. And again, once we change the sound from a sine wave to something with a bit more kind of bite to it, we may find ourselves in a kind of an interesting space. But the thing to appreciate here is that we're taking sort of core patterns and then we're adapting them for our own purposes, but we're also feel flexible in our approach, that we can kind of hybridize them and we can chop them up. We can kind of treat them a bit like samples in some ways. We can say, I only want that bit there. But the thing is, to kind of get there, we sort of have to start from a relatively simple position, right? We have to start from somewhere way simpler than maybe where our skills, maybe our skills in a DAW are really good, but actually our understanding of this other stuff might actually not be there. And that's kind of a point of frustration. But the thing is that we do need to start from a relatively simple or a more simplified kind of position. So it's going to be the end of that. We've gone sort of slightly over, but I would recommend to you that, watch some of the other videos in this series, download some of the tracks, the practice tracks. I've done at least 3 now, so there'll be quite a few coming online as we go along. You can download the projects. You've kind of got my advice in there in terms of the sorts of things that you can do in the project. You've got the video that supports that, and do sort of explore ideas around voicing. So basically where the note is really close to the root note, put it up an octave and see how that kind of cleans up your arrangement. You're still going to need to use EQ, but perhaps not as aggressively as you would have done. And then lastly, try and consider these ideas about patterns, 1/4/5s, and the more adventurous pattern that we looked at, which is the 1/0, flattened second, which is +1, and then the flattened seventh, which is -2, that we're using in this one here. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Please remember to like and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you next week. We're going to do another one. I'm not sure we're going to do one on Christmas Day because that's Friday, but we'll see, won't we? I might do one a little bit earlier. But see you next week at 2 o'clock. Take care now.